The official story is neat. Writing appears, civilization emerges, history begins. But neat stories are usually wrong. And recent evidence shows that writing may be far older than we thought. So here's the uncomfortable question. Why wouldn't early humans have written language? And if they did, what does that mean for how we view prehistory? Hi guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Michael. I have a degree in ancient history, and on this channel, we discuss the unexplainable mysteries of our past. Let's get into it. Writing is not just communication, it is external memory. It allows ideas to exist outside the human mind and survive long after the person who created them is gone. Before writing, knowledge had a built-in expiration date. It had to be memorized, repeated constantly, passed down orally, generation after generation. When people died, knowledge was always at risk of dying with them. But writing changes that relationship entirely. It allows information to accumulate rather than reset. Laws can persist, calendars can be standardized, rituals can remain consistent across centuries. That is why historians treat writing as the dividing line between prehistory and history. Prehistory is the time before written records. For example, we call Ice Age societies prehistoric not because they lacked culture or intelligence, but because they left no surviving written texts. History begins when writing appears. But notice the quiet implication hiding inside that definition. If writing existed but didn't survive, then we would still call that period prehistory. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing lasted. And that brings us to the critical question. How exactly do we decide when writing first appears? Officially, writing began around 3200 BC, based on clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. These tablets survive because clay, once fired, is extremely durable. It does not rot, it does not dissolve easily, it doesn't really care about time. But this creates an assumption that often goes unnoticed, that writing began on materials designed to last thousands of years. However, history tells us that is almost certainly false. Most writing throughout history was temporary, practical, and disposable. Notes, lists, tallies, reminders. You don't engrave your grocery list into stone. You scribble it onto something cheap, light, and replaceable. And ancient people did the same. They used wood, wax, leather, bark, and plant fibers, materials that archaeology almost never recovers. So when historians say this is the earliest writing, what they are really saying is this is the earliest writing that didn't decay. And once you realize that, you're forced to ask a much bigger question. What happens to this timeline when we look at societies that were complex, long before durable writing appeared? To explore this problem properly, we need to look at a site that genuinely rewrote the archaeological rulebook, Gobekli Tepe. It dates to around 9600 BC, long before farming, cities, or writing. And yet, what we find there is astonishing. Gobekli Tepe contains massive stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, arranged in carefully planned circular enclosures. This was not accidental construction. It required organization, coordination, and long-term planning on a large scale. You don't quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones like this without shared knowledge and structured communication. And that's where Gobekli Tepe becomes especially interesting, because carved into these pillars are repeated symbols and motifs. Animals, abstract markings, consistent imagery appearing across multiple structures. That repetition matters, because repetition suggests intention, and intention suggests meaning. Assyriologist Irving Finkel has argued that when you look closely at the imagery from Gobekli Tepe, you begin to see something that looks less like decoration and more like a symbolic system. In a conversation with Lex Friedman, Finkel points out a lesser-known artifact from the site, a small, rounded, green stone. It has an arched back and a flat underside, similar in shape to later stamp seals from Egypt and Mesopotamia, and carved into its flat surface are what appear to be hieroglyphic-style signs. Finkel argues that this object was likely a seal designed to be pressed into clay or another soft material to leave an impression. In other words, a tool used for ratification, for marking ownership, for approving transactions, for formalizing agreements. And according to the dating of the site, this object belongs to around 9000 BC. Now, it's important to be very clear here. This interpretation is controversial, it's not the mainstream position. But Finkel's reasoning is not just casual speculation. He argues that seals of this kind are not decorative objects, they are functional. They exist to leave repeated impressions, and repeated impressions imply a shared system of meaning. In Finkel's words, this seal is not just a squiggle on a pot. It is a finished object made for a specific bureaucratic purpose. And if that interpretation is correct, it would suggest a form of pictographic writing thousands of years earlier than traditionally accepted. But Finkel also raises a broader point. When he was a student, he was taught that writing emerged in Mesopotamia because cities became too complex to manage without it. Large populations, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade created problems of organization. The traditional argument is that writing was invented in Mesopotamia as a practical solution to manage that growing complexity. But then Gobekli Tepe thus presents a problem, because if that level of organization required writing in Sumer around 3000 BC, how was it achieved at Gobekli Tepe 7,000 years earlier? You don't organize a workforce of this scale with a megaphone and good intentions. The finish of the architecture is too precise, the planning is deliberate, the vision is coherent. Someone was coordinating this effort. Now again, to be clear, this does not prove that full writing existed at Gobekli Tepe, but it strongly suggests that symbolic systems capable of recording and communicating information were already in use. And remember, only 10% of this site has been excavated, so what else could be hiding beneath the ground? Imagine if an equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, the one artifact that allowed us to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, lay hidden in the unexcavated 90% of Gobekli Tepe. This thus leads to a natural next question. If early humans were using seals, symbols, or notation systems at this level, then what were they actually writing on? Because to answer that, we need to talk about the physical reality of writing itself. This is where the timeline really begins to unravel, because historically, writing does not survive by default, it survives by accident. And to see why, we need to look at what writing was actually made from. In Mesopotamia, where the earliest surviving writing appears around 3100 BC, clay was everywhere. The river plains of the Tigris and Euphrates were full of it, so scribes used what they had. They took damp clay and pressed marks into it with cut reeds, forming wedge-shaped impressions. This is where cuneiform comes from. Once dried in the sun, these tablets became extremely durable, almost indestructible in fact, which is why they survive in such large numbers even today, thousands of years later. But there's an important catch. Clay tablets are terrible for everyday communication. They're heavy, they're very fragile before they dry, and they're not exactly ideal for sending messages. So clay survives not because it was the best writing material, but only because it happened to fossilize well. Almost at the same time, around 3000 BC, the Egyptians solved a very different problem. They needed writing that could travel, so they invented papyrus, a smooth, flexible surface made from strips of a Nile plant, pressed and dried into sheets. Papyrus could be rolled into scrolls, it could be carried, it could be copied, and for over 3,500 years, almost every book in Egypt, Greece, and Rome was written on it. In other words, the ancient world almost overwhelmingly relied on a material that doesn't survive outside of dry deserts. That alone should make us nervous about how complete our record really is. Elsewhere, people used what worked locally. In China, bamboo strips were tied together with thread to form books. Records tell us that they were used as early as 1500 BC, even though the earliest surviving examples are much, much later. In India, palm leaves were used for manuscripts. Early Buddhist texts were written on birch bark. Romans, when cut off from papyrus supplies in Britain, wrote letters on thin wooden tablets. Some of these have actually survived near Hadrian's Wall, including something wonderfully human, a birthday invitation. Now, just imagine how much writing didn't survive. Wax tablets were used everywhere from Greece to Rome. They were reusable notebooks. You wrote on them, warmed the wax, and smoothed them flat again. They were designed to vanish, and they did. Later still, parchment appeared, more durable but expensive, used mainly for important texts. But even parchment only became common centuries after writing itself, and then much later, paper appeared in China around AD 105. It slowly spread westward, and it doesn't reach Europe in force until the medieval period, and even then, many early papers degrade rapidly. Books from as recent as the 19th century are already crumbling. So here's the uncomfortable truth. For most of human history, writing was done on materials that decay, which means the writing we have is not typical. It's exceptional. It survived because conditions were perfect, or because disaster accidentally preserved it. Now picture prehistoric writing, not carved in stone but scratched into bark, or written on leaves, or painted onto skins. Now give it 10,000 years. How about 100,000 years? Nothing would remain. And once you understand that, the absence of early writing becomes far less mysterious. But it also raises a much bigger problem. If so much writing is lost even in the historical periods that we know had writing, how reliable is the record that we think we're building our timelines on? And that question leads directly into the issue of survivorship bias. We naturally assume that what survives represents what once existed, but in archaeology, that assumption is almost always wrong. Even in recent periods where writing definitely existed, we recover only a tiny fraction of what was once written. Ancient libraries are a perfect example. We know they existed, we know they held vast collections of texts, but what survives today? Only fragments, references, mentions in other works, sometimes not even the titles. Writing often only survives when destruction accidentally preserves it. Fires bake clay tablets and turn them into ceramics. Collapses seal archives underground. Dry caves preserve organic material that should not exist at all. Everything else just disappears. And this isn't just a vague idea. Scholars have tried to quantify how much ancient writing actually has survived. Classicist N.G. Wilson has stated that perhaps only around 1% of classical literature has come down to us. That figure is often cited in discussions of the Archimedes palimpsest, but it's also supported by modern academic analysis. In a detailed study of ancient bibliography, historian Rudolf Bloom concluded that of all pagan Greek literature, only about 1% survives today. That's not 1% of minor works, that's 1% of everything. Bloom bases this estimate on earlier research by Hans Gerstinger. Out of roughly 2,000 known Greek authors, the complete works of only 136 survive. Fragments exist for another 127, but everything else is gone. And even that understates the loss, because Gerstinger counted only authors whose names we still know. He did not count works known only by title, or works listed in ancient bibliographies that no longer exist, or texts that vanished before they were ever catalogued. In other words, the ancient world produced far more writing than we can see. Even ancient scholars knew this. Bloom notes that Greek bibliographers struggled with the sheer volume of literature. So many authors existed that even contemporaries had trouble keeping track of them. But many works were already forgotten by just the 3rd century AD. Others vanished later, when scrolls were replaced by bound books, and only texts deemed worth copying made the transition, and some were lost deliberately, dismissed as unimportant or undesirable. So when we look at what survives today, we are not seeing a representative sample. We are seeing the lucky remnants, the leftovers, the raindrops, not the waterfall. But this means something crucial. If 99% of writing can disappear during very recent periods, the periods that we know had writing in just the last few thousand years, then silence in deep prehistory, a period covering hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly looks very different. Silence no longer means absence. It means loss. And once we accept that, we can finally ask a more responsible question. Not did writing exist earlier, but rather what does the evidence actually allow us to say? Now let's be precise. The evidence does not prove that full writing existed tens of thousands of years ago. That would go beyond what the data supports. But the evidence does allow a careful conclusion. The earliest surviving writing is not necessarily the first writing. That writing likely began as a fragile technology, and that it may have emerged, disappeared, and re-emerged multiple times. Think of it like early fire use. The first fires left no permanent trace, only later do hearths appear in the archaeological record. Writing may follow the same pattern, invisible at first until it finally leaves a mark that time cannot erase. And if that's true, we should expect to see earlier precursors to writing, which brings us much further back in time. Now we need to step much deeper into prehistory, far beyond Gobekli Tepe, all the way back to Upper Paleolithic Europe, between 30 and 40,000 years ago. This was the Deep Ice Age. Glaciers covered much of the continent, and yet humans were leaving marks that still speak to us today. Across cave sites throughout Europe, archaeologists have found symbols. Not animals, not hunting scenes, not decorative flourishes, but symbols. If you've ever seen images from caves like Lascaux or Altamira, you know how powerful the animal paintings are. Horses in motion, bisons mid-charge, bulls, bears and deer rendered with incredible skill. But as anthropologist Genevieve von Petzinger points out, those animals may have distracted us from something even more important. Hidden among them are small geometric designs. Dots, lines, triangles, crosses, discs. They're easy to overlook, and for decades they mostly were. But von Petzinger became fascinated by these markings precisely because of how strange they are. Millennia ago, someone went to the effort of carving or painting these symbols onto cave walls, in dark, hard-to-reach places. That alone raises a question. Why were they important enough to do that? To find out, von Petzinger and her photographer husband systematically recorded these symbols. They visited 52 cave sites across Europe, and what they found was remarkable. At 75% of the caves, they documented symbols that had never been recorded before. Even more striking, the symbols far outnumbered the animal and human figures. But the most astonishing discovery came later. No matter how many caves they visited, they kept finding the same small set of symbols, over and over again. After analysing the data, von Petzinger identified just 32 recurring shapes, and these symbols appear across an entire continent, over a time span of 30,000 years. That level of consistency can't be random. It strongly suggests shared meaning. As von Petzinger explains, quote, "If they weren't meaningful, people wouldn't keep replicating them." Now it's important to be clear about what these symbols are not. They are not a fully written language. There are not enough signs to represent spoken words. They don't repeat in the same way that alphabets or syllabaries do. But that doesn't mean they were meaningless. Von Petzinger argues that these markings function more like notation, a way of storing information, encoding ideas visually so they could be understood later by others. That is a huge shift, because this is the earliest evidence that communication wasn't limited to speech or gesture. It had become graphic, permanent, external. Now what the symbols mean exactly is still unknown. Some may represent objects, tools, or plants. Others could be clan signs. In some cases, there may be counting, tallying, or early mapping involved. The meanings are lost, but the system is not. Even more intriguing, von Petzinger found that 2/3 of these symbols were already in use when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. This suggests they were not invented locally. They may have been part of a much older tradition, possibly brought from Africa. In other words, symbolic communication may be far older than the European cave art itself. Now, von Petzinger does not claim these symbols are writing, but she is very clear about their significance. They show that humans were encoding and transmitting information symbolically tens of thousands of years earlier than traditionally assumed. And remember, these were found in caves, the most likely place for them to survive. So think of all the written communication from outside that has since been lost. Once you see that, a final, uncomfortable question emerges. If humans were already capable of storing symbolic information this early, how much of that symbolic world has vanished completely? And if so much was lost even here, then what chance did fragile early writing really have to survive? Which brings us to the final reckoning. What all of this suggests is not that ancient humans were mysterious geniuses. It suggests that they were practical. They used materials that worked, and those materials didn't last. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is often merely evidence of decay. The real mystery is not whether early writing existed. The real mystery is whether it had any chance of surviving long enough for us to see it. And that perhaps is the most important lesson archaeology is trying to teach us. Humans have been intelligent and writing for much longer than we thought. And this key signifier for civilization might go back far deeper into time than we ever imagined. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribing to my channel down below. I'll see you next time.